The marble was cool underfoot. That much would have been constant. The particular coolness of stone in the morning, before the Roman sun had found the courtyard and begun its work on the pale slabs. A young man crossed that courtyard on an unnamed morning in the middle of the 1st century, moving from one part of the household to another on some errand that history did not bother to record. The household belonged to Epaphroditus, a freedman who had made himself wealthy and powerful in the court of Nero. The young man belonged to the household. He was perhaps 17, perhaps 20. He had been born in Hierapolis in the province of Phrygia far to the east, and carried no memory of arriving in Rome because he had been too young when he arrived to carry anything at all. His name was Epictetus. The name was not a name so much as a designation. It meant in Greek, the acquired one, the one who had been obtained. And in the cool marble courtyard, on that unremarkable morning, he crossed from one side to the other, and was, by every measure, the world around him possessed, entirely without freedom. The world around him was very certain about what freedom looked like. It looked like the men who gave orders rather than received them. It looked like property, legal standing, the right to move through the city without accounting for your movements. Freedom was an external condition, a social fact, a status that could be granted or denied by other human beings exercising power over you. In Rome in the middle of the 1st century of the Common Era, this understanding of freedom was so deeply woven into the fabric of the visible world that almost no one thought to examine it. The examination would come later, and it would come from an unlikely direction, from the acquired one, crossing a marble courtyard in the morning, who had already begun, though he may not yet have known it, to ask a question that the world around him had not thought to ask. Not what freedom looked like from outside, what freedom felt like from within. It would be wrong to make that morning into a moment of quiet revelation, to cast a shaft of light across the stone and assign to the young man's expression some particular cast of philosophical intensity. That kind of shaping is the work of distance, and the distance here is nearly 2,000 years. What can be said more honestly is this, that the question was already forming somewhere in him, the way a question forms before it becomes articulable, as a kind of pressure, a persistent returning, a sense that the categories being handed to him by the world he moved through did not quite account for everything that he was. The marble was cool, the sun was beginning to climb, the household went about its business, and somewhere inside the acquired one, something was being held, carefully, the way one holds a coal that has not yet become a flame. Rome in those years was a city of enormous noise and enormous appetite, and underneath both of these, an enormous anxiety. The emperors of the Julio-Claudian line had made spectacle into a governing principle, and the spectacle required constant feeding. Under Nero, who reigned from 54 to 68 of the Common Era, Rome had become a place where wealth and safety were provisional, where the distance between the emperor's favor and the emperor's suspicion could be crossed in a single afternoon, and where the men and women who had accumulated the most were in some ways the most exposed. Epaphroditus, whose household Epictetus inhabited, understood this exposure. He had navigated the court carefully and would continue to navigate it until he did not. Power in that city was real, and it was also, as the young slave with the Greek name would eventually understand more clearly than almost anyone around him, a form of dependency so total that it constituted its own kind of captivity. Into this world, and into this household, had come the influence of a man named Gaius Musonius Rufus. Musonius was a Roman of the equestrian class, what would later be called a knight, which meant he occupied a social station as far above the young Epictetus as it was possible to be, while still moving in the same philosophical direction. He had been exiled under Nero, sent away from Rome to the island of Gyaros in the Aegean, a small and inhospitable rock that the emperors favored as a destination for people they wanted gone, but not dead. He had survived the exile, returned, been exiled again, and had come back to Rome with the serene impracticality of a man who had decided that what happened to him externally was not the main event. Musonius taught that philosophy was not an academic exercise. He was almost impatient on this point, in the way that people who have tested a belief against hard experience sometimes become impatient with those who treat it as merely theoretical. Philosophy belonged in the kitchen and in the bedroom, in the marketplace and in the relationships between parents and children. It belonged wherever a person actually had to make a decision about how to live. The lecture hall for Musonius was only a place to begin. Epictetus became his student. How exactly this came about is not entirely clear. The record is incomplete in the way that records of enslaved people's lives tend to be incomplete, shaped by the interests of those who controlled the material on which the record is kept. What is clear is that something passed between teacher and student that was more than information. Musonius had a way of treating philosophy as a practice that had consequences in real time, that either changed the way a person actually behaved on an ordinary morning or amounted to nothing worth taking seriously. This was not universally popular. Philosophical discourse in the Roman world had developed substantial traditions of erudition for its own sake, of elaborate argument as performance, but it was exactly the tradition into which Epictetus was most prepared to enter. He had not been educated for abstraction. He had been educated for nothing, or rather had educated himself while ostensibly being educated for service. And what he found in Musonius was a voice that matched what the marble courtyard had already been teaching him, without words, about the real location of what could and could not be taken away. The Stoic tradition from which Musonius drew ran back across 3 centuries to a man named Zeno of Citium, who had arrived in Athens around the year 300 before the Common Era, had sat with various teachers of various philosophical schools, and had eventually begun teaching his own students on a painted porch in Greek, a stoa, that gave the school its name. Zeno held that the good was identical with virtue and with virtue alone, and that everything else, wealth, health, status, beauty, the good opinion of others, even life itself, was a matter of what he and those who followed him called indifference. Not in the sense of carelessness or contempt, but in the technical philosophical sense that these things have no bearing on the only question that matters, whether a person is living rationally, in accordance with their nature as a reasoning being, in alignment with the larger rational order of the world. This was a position that sounded, to many who first encountered it, either obviously right or obviously impossible, and the Stoics spent the next several centuries working through the exact ways in which it was neither obvious nor impossible, but rather rigorously defensible if you were willing to follow the argument all the way through. Chrysippus came after Zeno, and where Zeno had built the house, Chrysippus furnished it. He wrote on logic and physics and ethics with an industriousness that later sources described as almost excessive. Some ancient accounts credit him with more than 700 works, though most of these have not survived. What survived, in fragments and in the testimony of later writers, was the architecture of a complete philosophical system, a logic that preceded Aristotle in some of its formal moves, a physics that placed the rational principle of the cosmos at the center of everything that happens, and an ethics that followed from both, with a consistency that even the school's critics found difficult to simply dismiss. By the time the tradition reached the Roman world, it had been tested and refined across generations of serious thought, and it had found in that world a particular kind of reader, practical, administratively burdened, looking for philosophy that held under actual pressure rather than only in classroom conditions. The sequence of teachers, Zeno to Chrysippus, and across the generations to Musonius, and then to Epictetus, was not a sequence of corrections or improvements so much as a sequence of inheritances. Each teacher received something from the tradition and held it long enough to understand what it required of a life, and then passed it forward to someone who would do the same. The image of a lamp moving from hand to hand carries something true about how this worked. Not the lamp of illumination as metaphor, but the lamp as a specific fragile, physical thing that needs to be held correctly, or it goes out, and that adds nothing to the flame but the warmth of the hands around it. Musonius held it and kept it lit through an exile that was designed to extinguish him. Epictetus received it in circumstances that made Musonius's exile look in some respects like comfortable inconvenience. And in receiving it, he did not simply preserve what he had been given, he burned more steadily than anyone before him had fully anticipated. The reign of Nero ended in 68 of the Common Era, badly, with Nero's own hand making the final contribution to its conclusion. After the chaos of the following year, the year of the 4 emperors, which moved so quickly that the traditional way of naming years after their consuls became almost incoherent, there came Vespasian, and then his sons Titus and Domitian, and the period of the Flavian dynasty. This is the period in which Epictetus was freed from slavery, which happened at some point in the late 60s or early 70s, though the exact date and the exact circumstances of the manumission are not recorded in a way that makes certainty possible. What is known is that he became a freedman, that he remained in Rome, and that he began to teach, not with the formal apparatus of a philosopher who has been endowed with a chair in a library, but in the direct, personal, argumentative mode that he had learned from Musonius, asking questions, pressing hard on the difference between what people said they believed and what they actually did when their beliefs were tested, insisting that philosophy which did not show up in a person's behavior by the end of the day had not yet done its work. Domitian was the last of the Flavian emperors, and he was the one whose tenure most directly shaped the outer contours of Epictetus's life. Domitian was, by most ancient accounts, a man of genuine administrative competence and genuine political paranoia, and these two qualities existed in him without moderating each other. He was not the worst emperor Rome produced. The bar for worst is lower than most modern observers want to approach. But he was the kind of ruler whose government made the practice of Stoic philosophy feel less like an academic exercise and more like a necessary equipment for daily survival. The Stoic philosophers, who had preceded Epictetus in the tradition, had not always paid for their commitments in merely intellectual currency. Epictetus, a senator who had made his philosophical convictions a form of political resistance to Nero, had been condemned to death and had opened his veins in the year 66. Helvidius Priscus, his son-in-law, had continued the tradition of Stoic resistance through the reign of Vespasian and had been executed under orders that were, depending on which ancient source is credited, issued reluctantly or not reluctantly at all. These were not, from the perspective of the surviving Stoic community in Rome, ancient history. They were the recent dead, the men who had sat with some of the same teachers, had argued from some of the same texts, and had found that the commitment to inner sovereignty, which the tradition taught, also had an outer expression, a refusal to bend to what the rational soul judged to be wrong, that the emperors of Rome did not tolerate, as a merely theoretical position. Epictetus would not have been unaware of this. He had not been a senator and would never be a senator, and the trajectory of his life was different from that of Thracia or Helvidius in almost every external respect. But the philosophy was the same philosophy, and the question of what it cost to hold it was present in the city he inhabited as something more than a philosophical puzzle. In 89 of the Common Era, Domitian issued an edict expelling philosophers from Rome and from Italy. The historical sources disagree about the precise scope and motivation of the edict, whether it was aimed primarily at Stoics, whether it was a response to specific political events, whether it was executed thoroughly or only selectively. But its effects on Epictetus were clear enough. He left Rome. He went west and then north, crossing eventually to the northwestern coast of Greece and settling in a city called Nicopolis, which sat near the strait between the Ionian Sea and the Adriatic in the region known as Epirus. He would spend the rest of his life there. Nicopolis had been founded by Augustus Caesar after his victory at the Battle of Actium in 31 before the Common Era, a battle that ended the civil wars that had followed Julius Caesar's assassination and established the political order of the Principate. Augustus had named the city Victory City and had built it with the self-conscious grandeur of a man who knew his victories would be studied. By the time Epictetus arrived, it was a prosperous Roman provincial town with the usual infrastructure of such places: baths, a theater, temples, administrative buildings, and a geography that made it a natural stopping point for traffic moving between the Roman West and the Greek East. It was not Rome. It had none of Rome's density, its spectacle, its particular quality of being the center of everything. And this was, Epictetus would eventually find, an advantage rather than a loss. The school he established in Nicopolis attracted students from across the Roman world. They came from the eastern provinces and from Italy, from families wealthy enough to send their sons to study philosophy, and not entirely sure that this was a practical investment. What they found when they arrived was not what most of them had expected to find. Epictetus taught in a way that made the comfortable uncomfortable and the uncomfortable, occasionally at home. He had no patience for students who treated philosophy as a decoration for social performance, and he said so directly in the mode of a man who had been acquiring the right to be direct since before most of his students were born. He was also, by the accounts that survived, genuinely kind, in the manner of someone who had worked through most of his own attachments and could therefore attend to other people with a steadiness that did not cost him. His leg gave him trouble. The ancient sources report that he had a leg injury. Some sources attribute it to an act of deliberate cruelty by Epaphroditus, which would place it in his years of slavery. Others are less specific about the cause. He walked with difficulty and relied on a stick in his later years. This is mentioned in the sources mostly as context, not as the subject of particular lament, and the impression given is that it was carried the way Epictetus carried most things, as something that was the case, as part of the conditions of the life he actually had, which was the only life available for philosophical work. The philosophy he taught was not a philosophy for ideal conditions. It was the one he had built out of non-ideal conditions, which was why it held when the conditions were hard, and which was the main reason people traveled long distances to sit in a small room in a provincial Greek city and listen to a freed slave with a damaged leg speak, without apparent urgency about the nature of freedom. A lamp burned in that room. This is not a metaphor. Oil lamps were the light source. The lessons continued after the sun went down, and the quality of the light in a room lit by a single oil lamp at night is something the modern world has largely stopped knowing from direct experience. Warm, unsteady, casting a circle of illumination that does not extend to the walls. The students would have sat within that circle. Epictetus would have moved within it, or sat within it, speaking in the way that Arian, a student who would later record what he heard, trying to hold the voice on the page before it escaped, described as the speech of a man entirely uninterested in oratorical performance and entirely absorbed in the substance of what he was saying. The lamp would have moved with the draft, the shadows on the walls shifting slightly, the students leaning forward or sitting back depending on whether what they were hearing required them to work or whether it had found them where they were. It is worth pausing on what the expulsion from Rome had meant and what Epictetus's arrival in Nicopolis had been. From the outside, viewed by someone who used the ordinary measures available in the first century of the Common Era, the move was a demotion, a reduction of circumstance, a loss of access and position and proximity to the center of things. Rome was the world in a way that Nicopolis was not and could not be. And yet there is no account of this transition in the surviving record, not in Arrian's record of Epictetus's spoken teaching, and not in the handbook that Arrian compiled from those records, that reads as the record of defeat. The philosophical voice that came through in Nicopolis was not diminished by the displacement. It was, if anything, more fully itself, as though the removal of Rome had removed something that the philosophy had not needed. And what remained was exactly what the philosophy had always been built from: a man who had worked out, under conditions that required the working out to be genuine rather than theoretical, exactly what could be taken away and exactly what could not. Epictetus was somewhere in his 30s or 40s when he arrived in Nicopolis. He had been born into the most constrained external condition the Roman world offered. He had been educated in the most rigorous philosophical tradition the same world had produced. He had been expelled from the capital by an emperor who feared what philosophy, practiced seriously, did to the relationship between a person and power. And he had arrived in a provincial city on the coast of northwestern Greece, set down whatever he carried, and looked out at an unfamiliar place beginning to become familiar. The harbor, perhaps, the particular color of the Ionian light, the streets that did not yet have the texture of known streets. Students had already begun to arrive, or would soon arrive, drawn by something that traveled faster than official communications, the word that there was a person here worth listening to, that the listening would not leave them unchanged, that the change was not comfortable, but was, when it came, irreversible in the way that genuine understanding tends to be irreversible, not because it overwhelms, but because once seen clearly, it cannot be unseen, and the life that follows the seeing is conducted on different ground. The ground of Nicopolis was not the marble of Rome. It was the ordinary ground of a Greek provincial city, warm in summer and cold in winter, the Ambracian Gulf nearby, the smell of the sea a constant background note. Epictetus had not chosen this place. He had been sent here by the mechanism of imperial power, exercising itself on the question of where philosophers could and could not be. And in this he shared something with every student who would later come to sit in his school, because none of them had chosen the conditions of their lives with anything like the deliberateness they brought to the study of what to do with those conditions. The conditions arrive first. The philosophy arrives second and finds the conditions already waiting and sets to work. The city that Augustus had built to commemorate his victory at Actium, the city that sat at the edge of the Greek world and the edge of the Roman one, became for a generation of students the place where the deepest questions about what it meant to be free were asked and worked through and asked again. Not because Nicopolis was a place of particular philosophical tradition, it was not Athens, was not Alexandria, but because a particular person had been placed there by the workings of a power that thought it was constraining him, and had found in the placing not constraint, but ground, a place to stand, a place to build from, a place where the lamp could burn without the interference of too much surrounding light. The lessons continued for decades. Students came and went, carrying something away with them that they tried to keep carrying when the difficulty of their own lives required it. Some kept it well, others let it slip and had to return to it. The returning was not shameful in Epictetus's school. The philosophy had nothing to say against returning, against finding that the understanding had been misplaced somewhere in the ordinary weeks and needing to be picked up again. What mattered was not that the understanding had been held perfectly and continuously. What mattered was that it had been genuinely found once, and that the finding had left a mark clear enough to navigate back to. In Hierapolis, decades before any of this, a child had been born into a condition that the world defined as the absence of freedom. The world was not entirely wrong by its own definitions. The child grew into a young man who crossed marble courtyards on other people's errands, who had no legal standing, no right to the labor of his own body, no claim on the trajectory of his days. These were real conditions with real weight, and the philosophy that eventually came from that young man did not pretend otherwise. It did not offer a different way of describing the conditions. It offered something more durable than redescription, the careful location within the conditions of exactly what the conditions could not reach. The lamp was passed as it had been passed before, from teacher to student, and from student to the next generation of students, and each pair of hands that held it in a slightly different way, breathing on it slightly differently, the flame moving with each breath, never going out. Zeno had held it on a painted porch in Athens. Chrysippus had held it through the careful construction of 3 centuries' worth of philosophical architecture. Musonius had held it through an exile on a barren Aegean island. And now Epictetus held it in Nicopolis, in a plain room with a circle of students, his leg giving him trouble, and the harbor somewhere nearby, and the night outside the lamp circle, as deep and ordinary as any other night. There was nothing urgent about the scene. There was nothing that required resolution before morning. The question had been here for a long time, and would continue to be here, patient and open, for as long as there were people willing to sit with it and be changed by the sitting. When Epictetus arrived in Nicopolis, he set down what he carried and looked at the city. It was not the city he had come from. It was not the city of his birth, which was far to the east, and it was not Rome, which was the city that had expelled him. It was a new city, built on a site that had once been a military camp, founded in the aftermath of a battle that decided who would govern the world. There was something appropriate in this that he may or may not have noticed, that the city built on the ground of a decisive victory should become the ground on which a former slave taught for the rest of his life, that the victories that mattered were the ones that happened entirely within a person, and that no emperor and no edict had any jurisdiction there. The city was unfamiliar. The streets would become familiar. The students would arrive, and he would receive them in the way that Musonius had received him, not as minds to be filled with philosophical content, but as people who had come, however they understood their own reasons for coming, to find out what exactly could never be taken away. The finding would take time. It always did, but the work had already begun in the small fact of arrival, in the plain act of setting something down on unfamiliar ground, and beginning, without particular ceremony, to make it a place where something lasting could be built. In the schoolroom at Nicopolis on an ordinary morning, Epictetus turned to the student nearest him and asked a question that had nothing to do with abstractions. There was a young man. Let him stand here for a moment, nervous, recently arrived from somewhere across the Roman world, who had come with the usual tangle of anxieties about a task he was expected to perform. A speech, perhaps, a meeting with someone powerful, something that mattered to him and that he was afraid of getting wrong. Epictetus did not begin with a theorem. He did not open a scroll or reach for the vocabulary of philosophy. He simply asked the young man to name, as precisely as he could, which part of the thing he was worried about was actually within his reach. The question landed quietly. It did not feel at first like a philosophical move. It felt like the kind of question a careful friend might ask someone not interested in soothing, but genuinely curious about where the trouble actually was. The young man hesitated. He began to list the things he feared: that the speech would go badly, that the audience would be indifferent or hostile, that he would be judged and found lacking. Epictetus listened. He let the list settle. Then he asked again, with the same patient precision, which of those things was something the student could actually do anything about. This was where the lesson began, not with a definition, not with a historical lineage of Stoic philosophers arranged in their proper order, but with a line drawn down the middle of one person's experience on one specific morning, separating what was within reach from what was not. The distinction Epictetus was drawing had been the axis of his teaching for years by then. It ran through everything he said, returned in every conversation, shaped every argument the Nicopolis schoolroom ever produced. In its simplest form, it holds that some things are in our power and some things are not. Said plainly like that, it sounds obvious, almost too simple to have traveled 2,000 years and still be worth the attention of a person lying in the dark. But the simplicity is a kind of precision, and the precision held steadily changes how almost everything looks. What falls on one side of the line is not a long list. The things that are genuinely, completely, unconditionally within a person's power are the movements of their own mind, the quality of their attention, the direction of their desire, the way they hold whatever impression comes to them, the judgment they choose to endorse or withhold. These things, Epictetus held, belong to the person entirely. No emperor can reach them, no master, no illness, no turn of fortune, no crowded room of hostile judges. They are the one domain of absolute sovereignty, available to any human being, under any condition, in any century. What falls on the other side is everything else, the body with its needs and vulnerabilities, health, which comes and goes according to causes that do not consult the person who has it, reputation, which lives in other people's minds and is shaped by forces far outside any single person's governance, wealth, which is borrowed from a world that will eventually ask for it back, the outcome of any action, no matter how carefully prepared, what other people think, what other people do, whether the speech lands well or poorly, whether the audience is generous or cold, not in the sense that our happiness, our stability, our sovereignty as thinking beings should be made to rest on it. The young man in the schoolroom had come carrying a weight. He had built his sense of how the morning would go on a foundation of things he could not control, and the instability of that foundation was what he felt as fear. Epictetus was not asking him to stop caring about the speech. He was not asking him to perform indifference or to pretend that the outcome was without value. He was asking something more precise than that. He was asking the student to look carefully at where his concern was actually directed, to notice that the part of the task that was genuinely his, the preparation, the sincerity of his thinking, The quality of attention he brought to what he was trying to say had not been lost and could not be taken. The rest was not nothing, but it was not his. There is a word Epictetus used for what he was pointing at, the one domain of real human sovereignty, the capacity for rational, deliberate choice. The word is proheresis. It is harder to say in English than it is to feel, which may be why the experience of it is easier to approach through an example than through a definition. Proheresis is the faculty by which a person chooses how to respond to whatever impression the world delivers. It is not the same as choosing what happens. No one chooses what happens. The impression arrives, the insulting word, the piece of bad news, the failure, the humiliation, the body's sudden pain, and arrives without asking permission. But between the arrival of the impression and the response to it, there is a space, small, sometimes very small. In that space, something happens that is genuinely the person's own. The endorsement or the withholding, the judgment about what the impression means and what it is worth, the choice of how to hold it. This was the territory Epictetus cared about. Everything he taught turned on it. And what he taught, slowly and with great patience, was that this territory is not a consolation prize, the small sovereign patch left to a person after the world has taken everything more obviously valuable. It is, on his account, the only real prize. The other things, health, reputation, success, the approval of the crowd, these have value. He was not suggesting otherwise, but their value is conditional, limited, dependent on factors outside any person's governance. The value of proheresis is not like that. What a person does with their own rational faculty, the quality of judgment and choice they bring to whatever comes this, he held, is the one thing that cannot be diminished by anything that happens to them. It is worth sitting with how strange that claim is, and how much it cuts against the ordinary assumptions of ordinary life. Most people, most of the time, build their sense of how things are going on exactly the things Epictetus places outside the boundary. If the body is healthy, things are going well. If reputation is intact, things are going well. If there is money enough, and the people one loves are safe, and the work is going forward, and the audience responded warmly, then things are going well. And when any of those conditions fails, things are going badly. This is not a foolish way to live. It is in some sense the natural way, but Epictetus had noticed something about it. A life built on that foundation is permanently fragile, not because bad things are likely to happen, though they are, but because the foundation itself, external, ungovernable, susceptible to the 10,000 forces no person can control, is not a foundation at all. It is a surface, and surfaces move. What he was offering was something that does not move, not because it is made of stronger material, but because it is located somewhere that fortune cannot reach. The quality of attention a person brings to a difficult morning, the honesty of the thought they are trying to think, the integrity of the choice they make when no one is watching and nothing external compels them. These are the things Epictetus kept pointing at. They are not glamorous. They are not the stuff of reputation or visible achievement, but they are, on his account, the only genuinely stable ground available. The student in the schoolroom needed to hear something like this, not because he was in extraordinary difficulty, but because he was in the ordinary difficulty of a person who has confused what is his with what is not his, and built his morning on the confusion. Epictetus did not solve the problem for him. He did not tell him what to say in the speech or how to manage the audience. He drew the line. He showed the student where the boundary ran. And the act of drawing it, the slow, deliberate sorting, of which part of the task was genuinely within reach and which was not, already began to do something to the weight the young man had been carrying. The Stoic tradition that Epictetus was working from had always held that the good is simpler than most people believe. Not simpler in the sense of easier to achieve, but simpler in the sense of being fewer things than ordinary life assumes. Virtue, on the Stoic account, is the only genuine good. Not virtue as a vague moral aspiration, but as a precise quality of rational judgment and choice, the faculty of prohairesis, exercised well, consistently, in full alignment with reason. This was the good. Everything else, on the strictest version of the account, was something else, neither good nor bad in itself, available to be used well or badly, worth preferring to its absence, in many cases, but not the thing on which a stable, free, genuinely human life could rest. This is the philosophical position behind the distinction Epictetus was drawing in the schoolroom. The Stoics had a careful vocabulary for the middle territory, the things that are worth preferring without being genuine goods, the things worth avoiding without being genuine evils. Health is preferable to illness. Wealth is preferable to poverty. The warmth of other people's regard is preferable to their hostility. None of this is denied, but the preference is held lightly, which is to say, it is held as a preference and not as a need. What a person genuinely needs, on Epictetus's account, is available in every condition, under any circumstance, in a body that is failing, or a reputation that is ruined, or a fortune that has been taken. What a person genuinely needs is the use of their own rational faculty, intact and uncorrupted. Everything else is welcome when it comes, and accepted when it goes. The practical work of living this way, of actually inhabiting the distinction, rather than merely acknowledging it as an interesting idea, requires something more than occasional reflection. Epictetus taught a kind of daily discipline, a deliberate sorting that could be practiced before the day began, before leaving the schoolroom, before setting out into the ordinary machinery of Roman life, with its courts and markets and social hierarchies. A person could take each anticipated task and encounter and ask, quietly and without urgency, which part of it was genuinely theirs. Not as a way of lowering expectations or cultivating detachment from everything that mattered, as a way of knowing where to look. The preparation for the speech belongs to me. The sincerity of the thought belongs to me. The quality of attention I bring to the people I will meet today belongs to me. Whether the speech lands well does not belong to me. Whether the person I am meeting chooses to be generous or difficult does not belong to me. Whether the day unfolds according to any of my plans, this is not mine to govern. Sorting it out in the morning, before the heat of the day, while the mind is still quiet and the impressions have not yet begun arriving in their usual volume. This was one way the Stoic discipline became practical rather than theoretical. Not a philosophy confined to the schoolroom, but a tool small enough to carry out the door. This was what Musonius Rufus, Epictetus's own teacher, had insisted on. Philosophy belongs in the actual texture of a life, in the kitchen, in the small decisions of an ordinary morning, in the way a person holds the news that something has gone wrong. Not in the lecture hall alone, not in the elevated discourse of scholars, but wherever a person is trying to figure out how to live. What Epictetus inherited from Musonius was precisely this insistence that the philosophy must work at the scale of experience. The dichotomy of control, as it is sometimes called, is not a theoretical structure erected above daily life and admired from a distance. It is a practice that runs through daily life, quietly, reorganizing what a person reaches for and what they hold. There is an image that helps A hand holding something, not gripping, not clenching, but holding with the ordinary steadiness of someone who is not afraid of what they are holding and is not straining to keep it. Now, from somewhere comes the clear understanding that the thing in the hand does not belong there, not because it has no value, but because it was never the person's to hold. It arrived from somewhere outside. It can leave from somewhere outside. Its staying or going is not within reach of the will. And with that understanding, arrived at not suddenly, but slowly, through the patient practice of looking carefully at what is actually the case, the hand opens, not in frustration, not in grief, not with the defeated gesture of someone who has lost something they wanted, with the deliberateness of a person who has understood, finally and clearly, what they were actually holding, and set it down. The line Epictetus was drawing runs through the middle of every anxiety, every ambition, every fear, every hope. On one side, what the rational will can actually govern. On the other, everything else. Drawing the line takes practice. The habits of a lifetime run in the opposite direction. From earliest awareness, most people learn to reach for the things on the wrong side of the line, to build their sense of how the day is going on the responses of other people, on the condition of the body, on whether the outcomes match the plans. And the reorientation Epictetus was describing is not accomplished in a single morning. It is accomplished slowly through repeated practice, through the daily discipline of drawing the line again and again, as many times as necessary, until the sorting becomes habitual and the habit becomes something like freedom. The young man who came to the Nicopolis schoolroom with his nervousness about the speech was not facing a catastrophe. He was facing the ordinary difficulty of a person living inside the ordinary confusion about what belongs to them. Epictetus treated this with the same patience he would bring to larger questions, because the ordinary confusion is where the larger questions live. It is in the small daily anxieties, the speech that might go poorly, the meeting that might go wrong, the ordinary morning's weight of uncontrollable outcomes, that the dichotomy of control either becomes a living practice or remains an interesting idea that does nothing. What Epictetus showed the student was not a technique for achieving a better outcome. He was not a teacher of success. He was a teacher of something else, of the discovery, made slowly and through practice, that the outcome was never the real thing at stake. The real thing at stake was always what the person brought to the task, the quality of their preparation, the honesty of their thinking, the integrity of their effort. These things, given fully, are given completely. Nothing about the audience's response can add to them or take from them. What the student could bring to the speech, genuine thought, careful preparation, the best quality of attention he could manage, this was his entirely before the speech began, and would remain his regardless of how the speech was received. There is something in this teaching that runs against a very deep grain. The grain it runs against is the assumption, so ordinary it mostly goes unexamined, that the measure of whether something went well is what happened as a result. The speech that landed well went well. The decision that led to a good outcome was the right decision. The effort that produced the hoped-for result was worth making. Epictetus was suggesting something else. The measure of whether something went well is the quality of what was brought to it from the side that is genuinely within reach. The speech that was prepared with honesty and delivered with care was a good speech, regardless of how it was received. The decision made with clear judgment and genuine attention to what was right was a good decision, regardless of what followed from it. The effort that drew on the full quality of what was available was worth making, regardless of the result. The result, in every case, was on the other side of the line. This is not a counsel of indifference to outcomes. People are allowed to prefer that things go well. They are allowed to hope, to plan, to work toward the conditions they want to bring about. The Stoics were never teaching that nothing outside the mind mattered, or that the world beyond prohiersis was without value. They were teaching something more precise, that the stability, the freedom, the genuine well-being of a person cannot be located in outcomes, because outcomes are not in that person's possession. To tie one's well-being to what one cannot govern is to be permanently at the mercy of a world that will not always cooperate, and often will not cooperate at all. The release that comes from understanding this is not the release of someone who has stopped caring. It is the release of someone who has stopped holding something that was never theirs to hold. The hand opens. The thing settles into the water. The morning, with its speech and its uncertainty and its uncontrollable audience, becomes something different, not a test that might be passed or failed depending on outcomes, but a field in which the only genuinely relevant effort is the one that is already, completely, within reach. The schoolroom in Nicopolis held this conversation in one form or another for years. Different students, different anxieties, different versions of the same fundamental confusion about what belongs to the person and what belongs to the world outside the person. Epictetus returned to the same distinction again and again, not because it was the only thing he had to say, but because it was the foundation on which everything else stood. Strip it away, and the rest of the teaching has nowhere to rest. Keep it clearly in view, and the rest follows with a kind of quiet logic. The line, once drawn clearly, does something unexpected. It does not divide the world into the territory one controls and the territory one must resign oneself to. It does not produce the bleak geography of a person surrounded by uncontrollable forces and retreating to a small interior fortress. What it produces when the drawing is careful and the practice is sustained is something more like spaciousness, the anxious reaching for what is not within reach, the constant monitoring of reputation, the endless calculation of outcomes, the vigilance about what other people are thinking and whether it is favorable. This takes enormous effort. It is exhausting in a way that is easy to miss because it is so constant. When it begins to ease, and it eases through the repeated practice of drawing the line, of returning to what is actually available, of releasing what is not, what is left is not emptiness. It is something that might, at first, be mistaken for emptiness, but is closer to the absence of a weight that had been there so long it had stopped registering as weight. Epictetus knew this territory, not from theory. From the years inside Epaphroditus's household, inside a condition of legal powerlessness that could not have been more complete, where the practice of drawing the line was not an abstract discipline, but the only available architecture of a free life. The philosophy he taught at Nicopolis had been built in conditions that gave it an unusual kind of durability. The dichotomy of control had not been discovered in comfort. It had been found by someone for whom the question of what, exactly, could never be taken away was not academic. What could never be taken was the quality of thought, the direction of desire, the honest attempt at judgment. These remained, through whatever condition the world imposed, and through the legal status that gave other people power over the body and its movements, through the injury to the leg, which had happened and which the body carried, and which was not the relevant thing. Through all of it, the rational faculty, the capacity for proheri, the one domain of genuine sovereignty, this remained, intact, available, completely the person's own. The student who came to the Nicopolis schoolroom, anxious about his speech, would have heard all of this, or some version of it, on that ordinary morning. He would have left with something different from what he arrived with, not certainty about the outcome, not the removal of difficulty, something more useful than either, the knowledge of where to look. The preparation was his, the honesty was his, the quality of thought he was bringing to what he wanted to say was his. These things could be given fully, without reservation, without the constant peripheral anxiety about whether the outcome would justify the effort. The outcome was on the other side of the line, and the line, once drawn, was not a wall. It was something else. It was the boundary of a territory, small perhaps, at first, smaller than most people expect when they first hear about it. The one domain in which the will is sovereign, in which no external force has jurisdiction, in which what happens next is genuinely, entirely, the person's own. Smaller than the territory most people assume they govern, but more solid, more genuinely theirs. And the boundary itself, once felt with some clarity, not as an idea but as an experience, the experience of standing on one side of it and recognizing what lies on the other, does something to the person standing at it. It does not close them in, it opens something. Imagine a hand again, holding something that is heavy, not because the thing itself is heavy, but because it has been held with so much effort for so long, held with the wrong kind of tension, the tension of a person trying to govern what cannot be governed, trying to keep stable what will not stay stable, trying to ensure an outcome that was never within reach of the will. The tension is familiar. Most mornings it is simply the texture of the morning, and now, slowly, on an ordinary morning in a room in Nicopolis, or somewhere much later and much farther away, something shifts, not dramatically, not with the force of a sudden insight, more like the way the quality of light changes so gradually that by the time the room is noticeably different, the change has already been happening for a long while. The hand opens, the thing settles into the water receives it without disturbance. And what remains in the hand is not loss. It is the hand itself, open, available, ready for whatever can actually be held. This is where the line between what is ours and what is not, drawn carefully and returned to, eventually leads. Not to a divided world in which the person is stranded in a small interior province while everything important happens outside it, to the recognition that the province was never small, that it was, in fact, the only territory that ever fully belonged to anyone, that the reaching outward, the endless anxious effort to govern what cannot be governed, to secure what cannot be secured, to ensure that the audience responds well and the outcome justifies the effort, and the world cooperates with the plan, was always reaching past the boundary into somewhere else, somewhere real and worth attending to, but not the ground of anything that lasts. The ground of what lasts is on the near side of the line, in the quality of the thought, in the honesty of the choice, in the careful, patient, repeated practice of asking before the day begins, and in the middle of the day, and at the end of it, which part of whatever is happening is genuinely within reach, not as a discipline of resignation, as a discipline of return, a return to the only territory that is, without qualification and under any condition, completely the person's own. The student left the schoolroom. The speech was ahead of him. The audience was uncontrollable, as audiences always are. The outcome would be whatever it was going to be. And on the way to wherever the speech would be given, somewhere between the schoolroom door and the place where the words would be spoken, there was a moment, perhaps small, perhaps barely registered, in which he noticed that the weight was different, not gone, not irrelevant, but held differently. The line had been drawn, the territory was clear, and for that morning at least, the hand was open. The argument was already running when the student arrived, Epictetus was mid-sentence, his hands still, his voice unhurried, and the small room in Nicopolis held the particular quiet of a place where something difficult was being made plain. He was not building toward a conclusion. He was already inside one, turning it over, showing its edges, asking the men seated around him to look at where the light fell through and where it did not. A student had come in, folded himself onto a bench near the back, and Epictetus had not paused. The thinking continued, the room continued, and the argument, as arguments do when they are alive, simply gathered the new listener in. He was talking about a man who had been humiliated. Not a story from a distant age, not a legend, but something that had happened recently. A man in Nicopolis who had gone before someone powerful, had been spoken to harshly, had been made small in front of others, and had come away from the encounter burning with the particular feeling of having been diminished. The students knew the kind. The feeling was familiar. Epictetus looked at it without hurry. What exactly, he asked, had been taken? He did not ask the question with contempt. He asked it the way a craftsman asks about a joint in a piece of wood, with professional interest, with the genuine intention of finding out what had the powerful man actually reached and removed. The other man's health was intact. His reasoning was intact. His capacity to know what was true and what was false, his capacity to form an honest judgment, his capacity to decide what to pursue and what to leave alone. None of this had been touched. What had been touched was a feeling. What had been disturbed was an assessment. And both of those, Epictetus said, with the patience of someone explaining something for perhaps the 400th time, and finding it no less worth explaining, had their origin entirely inside the man who was now burning with them. This was the center of what Epictetus taught, and it is worth staying with before anything else is said. The Stoic tradition, which Epictetus had received from his teacher Musonius Rufus, and which ran back through centuries of careful thinking, had developed a very specific account of where the human being actually lived. Not in the body, though the body was real, not in social standing, though social standing had its uses. The human being, in the fullest sense, the part that thought, assessed, chose, and consented, lived in something the Stoics called the hegemonikon, the ruling faculty, the governing center of the rational soul. It is not a metaphor, or not only a metaphor. It was their name for the specific capacity that separates a considered response from a reflex, a chosen orientation from a simple appetite. The hegemonikon was where the human being, in the most serious sense, actually was. And this was not abstract for Epictetus, for it was the ground of everything that followed. Because if the human being, in the fullest sense, lives in this governing center, in the capacity to assess, to choose, to assent or withhold assent, then the question of what can actually harm a person becomes a very different question than it ordinarily seems. What reaches the body does not automatically reach the ruling faculty. What reaches the reputation does not automatically reach the capacity for honest judgment. What reaches the social standing, the comfort, the ease of circumstance, none of these, Epictetus insisted, none of them reach the thing that matters most, unless the person living in that ruling faculty chooses to let them in. Unless through a judgment made consciously, or through habit so old it has become invisible, the person decides that what has happened to the body, the reputation, the comfort, constitutes a genuine harm to what they most essentially are. The student at the back of the room was listening now with a particular quality of attention. Epictetus sat with that for a moment. Then he continued. "There is a Roman emperor," he said, not naming one, not needing to, surrounded at every hour by guards, whose loyalty he cannot fully trust, by advisers whose counsel may be wrong, by borders that require constant holding against forces he cannot fully predict. There is a body that wakes some mornings already informing him of what it needs. There is a treasury that depends on harvests, on trade routes, on the cooperation of merchants and soldiers and provincial governors across an enormous distance. Every layer of his power, Epictetus said, is also a layer of need. Every protection he has arranged is also a dependency he has incurred. The man who commands the armies cannot command the loyalty in the army's hearts. The man who disposes of estates and titles and the fates of lesser men has not for a single morning in his life disposed of the weather. He is, Epictetus said, in a very precise sense, a servant. This was not said with pleasure. It was not said with contempt for emperors or with any desire to diminish the real weight of imperial power. It was said as a philosophical observation. The man who wants what he cannot fully control lives in a condition of permanent exposure to events that can disappoint him. The man who needs what he cannot guarantee is dependent, in the exact degree of that need, on things that are not himself. And this is true whether the man in question controls one garden or the whole known world. Scale does not change the structure. The emperor and the slave are at this level of analysis in the same relationship to the things outside their ruling faculty. They both want and both find that wanting is a form of vulnerability that external circumstance can always find. A student, one of the older ones, a man who had been coming to Nicopolis for 2 seasons, shifted slightly. This was the point, Epictetus knew, where the argument tended to feel uncomfortable. Not because it was wrong, but because it contradicted something most people had been quietly assuming their whole lives. That safety came from more, that peace came from securing, that if only the circumstances could be arranged correctly, the deep restlessness would settle. Epictetus did not avoid the discomfort. He sat in it with the student, and the room held both of them. Here is what the argument actually says, he continued, and this part required care. It is not that the body does not matter. It is not that health is of no account, or that the loss of a person one loves is a small thing, or that poverty is pleasant. The Stoic tradition he was working inside had always been precise about this. There are things that are preferred, genuinely preferred, over their opposites. Health is preferred over illness. Enough to eat is preferred over hunger. Connection is preferred over isolation. None of this is denied. The argument is not that these things have no value. The argument is that their value is of a different kind, a lesser, conditional, circumstantial kind than the value of the governing center of a person's rational life. They are, to use the Stoic term that Epictetus did not always bother with in conversation, but that stands behind the teaching, indifference, not meaningless, not matters of no account, but not, in the end, where the good actually lives. The good lives in what a person does with what they have been given. A man with a damaged leg, Epictetus's own, can still form honest judgments. A man who has been enslaved can still refuse, at the governing level of his thinking, to treat his captivity as a comment on his worth. A man who has lost everything the world considers important still has, until something removes the capacity for thought itself, the one thing that the whole Stoic tradition pointed at and named with such care, the prohairesis, the faculty of deliberate considered choice, the domain of complete sovereignty, which is also the domain of everything that genuinely matters. No emperor can reach it. That is not a slogan, it is a philosophical claim with a specific structure. The claim is that between any external event, Any insult, any loss, any harm done to the body or the circumstances, and the movement of the rational soul, there is a gap, a small gap sometimes, a gap that habit and exhaustion can make nearly invisible, but a gap that is always there because the rational soul is not a mirror that simply reflects what the world sends at it. The rational soul is an agent. It receives impressions, and then it does something with them. It assesses, it considers, it decides, at least in principle, what weight to assign and what response to make. And this act of assent, this moment where the mind endorses or withholds endorsement from the impression it has received, this is where the human being, in the philosophically serious sense, actually lives. The Stoics called this synchetathesis, assent, the act by which the mind says yes to an impression, takes it in, lets it become a judgment, lets the judgment become an emotion, lets the emotion become a condition of suffering, or fear, or hope, or grief. The mechanism runs in both directions. The impression arrives. The mind can receive it, examine it, and consent to the story it tells, or the mind can receive it, examine it, and decline to take the next step. The declining is not denial. It is not the suppression of the experience, or neither is the refusal to let the experience close the gap. This is what Epictetus meant when he said, and he said it in various forms so many times that Arian, the student who wrote down what happened in that room, recorded it in sentence after sentence across the length of the discourses, that people are not disturbed by events, but by the judgments they form about events. The event is what it is. The event happens outside the ruling faculty, in the world of bodies and objects and other people's actions. The judgment happens inside, and the judgment in the end is the only thing the ruling faculty is entirely unconditionally responsible for. The older student looked at his hands. Epictetus noticed the way he always noticed things in the room, with the quiet attention of someone who has spent a long time watching what happens in people when a hard idea lands. He did not say anything for a moment. He let the silence hold the thought where it was. Then he said something like this. The exact words are not preserved, but the shape of the argument is that understanding this is the beginning of something, not the end. Because the gap between the impression and the assent is not wide, not for most people, not at first. The habits run deep, the body's quick reflexes, the old patterns of judgment about what constitutes a threat or a loss, the accumulated weight of years of treating reputation and comfort and the approval of others as genuine goods, all of this has built, over time, a very efficient mechanism for skipping past the gap entirely. The impression arrives and the suffering is already there, the anger is already there, the fear is already there, before any examination has had a chance to occur. So the work is long. Epictetus never pretended otherwise. The work is a retraining of what happens in the space between the impression and the response. Not a single dramatic moment of enlightenment, after which nothing disturbs again, but a slow, careful, repeated practice of pausing, of asking, of finding the gap that is always there, and learning to stand in it long enough to ask, does this impression tell the truth? Does this event constitute the harm it presents itself as? Is the thing being threatened something that actually matters, or something I have been in the habit of treating as though it matters? A student near the front of the room, young, restless, not yet comfortable with stillness, asked a question that was essentially the question everyone in the room was sitting with. What about the things that genuinely hurt? Not reputation, not social standing. Those are easy to dismiss once the argument has been made. But real pain, real grief, real loss. Epictetus looked at him with something that was not quite patience and not quite compassion, but something that lived between the two. He did not dismiss the question. He did not say that pain is an illusion, or that the Stoic philosopher feels nothing, or that the proper response to loss is a kind of serene indifference that resembles coldness from the outside. He would never have said any of those things, and if the surviving record of his teaching makes anything clear, it is that his version of Stoic philosophy was concerned, before almost anything else, with the actual texture of lived experience, with what it is really like, with what actually happens inside a real person when something they care about is taken or threatened. What he said, in various forms across many conversations, was this: there is a difference between being moved and being ruled. A person who has lost someone they loved will be moved. The loss reaches the body, reaches the emotional life, reaches all the places where attachment had built its structures. Epictetus did not pretend otherwise. The Stoics were not a school that taught the absence of feeling. They were a school that taught a very specific relationship to feeling, one in which the feeling is received, acknowledged, held, but one in which the feeling is not then given authority over the governing center of the rational life. The grief is real. The grief is appropriate to what has been lost. But the grief, however deep, does not reach the ruling faculty unless the ruling faculty hands itself over, unless, at the level of judgment, the person decides, consciously or through habit, that the loss means something about the worth of existence, about the possibility of going on, about whether the world can still be inhabited with integrity. The philosopher in genuine grief is still a philosopher. The faculty of honest assessment does not go dark. This was not easy to hear. The young student near the front sat with it. Epictetus did not rush him. The room in Nicopolis had a particular quality in the afternoon, when the light came through the high windows at an angle that fell across the floor in long pale bars. The students in that light looked, to anyone watching from outside, like people engaged in very ordinary work, sitting, listening, occasionally writing something down. The room could have been any room. The work could have been any work. But what was happening in the room was something quite precise. A group of people were together, being asked to locate the exact boundary of what external circumstance could reach, not to make that boundary larger than it was, not to pretend the body did not feel what it felt, or that the social world did not have real consequences for the quality of a life, but to find, with the accuracy that the argument demanded, where the real limit lay, to draw the line clearly, and to discover in the drawing of it that there was a domain, small in some ways compared to the enormous machinery of the world, that nothing outside could enter without an invitation. Epictetus had a way of returning to this point from different directions. He was a teacher, and he understood that the same argument, heard from different angles, settles differently each time. He would come at it through the image of a role in a theater. A person does not choose every role they are given. Some roles arrive at birth. Some arrive through the choices of other people. Some arrive through the grinding of forces so large that individual choice seems irrelevant. Slave, exile, citizen, father, patient, prisoner. The role arrives. What belongs entirely to the person playing it is the quality of the playing, not the applause, not the length of the performance, not the other actor's lines, only the quality of what is done inside the role with the particular capacities the role player actually has. This was not a diminishment. It was, in Epictetus's hands, a liberation of a very specific kind. the liberation that comes from having found the exact domain that is genuinely yours after years of spending energy on domains that were never yours at all. He would come at it again through the image of a guest at a feast. The dishes come around, the dish that is offered now, the one right in front of the hand. Yes, take what is offered, enjoy what is actually here. The dish that has not yet arrived, wait with equanimity. Do not reach for it before it comes. The dish that has passed, let it go. Do not mourn it into the next course. The feast is the feast. It is not improved by reaching past what is here toward what is not. And he would come at it more bluntly than with any other image, through the teaching that always startled students who heard it for the first time, and that is easy to misread until it is placed in its proper philosophical setting. He would say, the door is always open, not as counsel of despair, not as anything like an encouragement toward self-destruction. The opposite. The point of the open door was that the rational soul, at the deepest level, is never trapped. There is always a final choice. There is always, somewhere in the structure of being a person who can reason, a sovereignty that no external condition has the power to dissolve entirely. The door stands open as a reminder not that the room is intolerable, but that the person standing in the room is there by something that approaches, if not consent exactly, then at least the ongoing active daily engagement of a self that has not been erased. This gave Epictetus the philosophical ground for what seemed, from the outside, like an impossible serenity, not the serenity of someone who has been numbed, or who has never suffered, or who does not understand what suffering is. The serenity of someone who has located, very precisely, the exact domain that cannot be reached, and who has made that domain the thing they actually live in. There is something in the structure of this that requires slowing down to feel. The governing faculty of the rational soul is not a fortress. It is not a wall built up through effort against the world's constant assaults. It is more like the recognition of a condition that was always already true, that the capacity for honest judgment, the capacity for considered choice, the capacity to examine an impression before endorsing it, is simply what a rational creature has. It does not need to be built. It only needs to be recognized, and the recognition, which the whole long practice of Stoic philosophy was aimed at making permanent rather than occasional, changes the relationship to everything else. What changes is not the world. The world continues to move exactly as it did before, with its losses and its difficult people and its sudden reversals of fortune and its incurable tendency not to cooperate with what was planned. What changes is the position from which all of this is met. From inside the ruling faculty, held clearly, knowing exactly what it is and what it is not, the world looks different. Not smaller, not less real, but differently bounded. The things that used to seem to come all the way in, the insults, the failures, the accumulated evidence of a life that has not gone as intended, are seen from this position to have stopped at the threshold. They reached the body. They reached the surface of the emotional life. They reached the story that could be told about them. But something in the middle of what the person most essentially is remained its own. The young student near the front of the room had stopped fidgeting. There is a particular quality of stillness that comes over a room when something has landed, not with a bang, not with the bright jolt of something surprising, but with the quiet weight of something that has been true all along and is only now being recognized. The room in Nicopolis had that quality sometimes. Epictetus had taught long enough to know it and to leave it alone when it arrived. He taught in that room for years. The students came from across the Roman world, from wealthy families in Greece and Asia Minor, from the households of Roman citizens who wanted their sons educated, from places far enough away that the journey itself was a kind of commitment. They came to sit with a man who had been a slave, who walked with difficulty on a leg that had been damaged long before Nicopolis, who owned essentially nothing that the world counted as valuable, and who spoke about freedom with an authority that no one in the room was in any position to dispute, because the authority came from somewhere that could not be faked. What Epictetus had was not the authority of position or of education in the formal sense, or of any of the things that the Roman world understood as conferring the right to speak about how life should be lived. What he had was something that every person who sat in that room could feel, in the way that the presence of something genuinely inhabited feels different from the performance of it. He had actually found the boundary. He had actually lived for the length of a life that had given him every reason to look for it, inside the governing center of his own rational soul, and had discovered there what he spent every morning in that schoolroom trying to hand to the people around him. Not a philosophy to be memorized and carried away, not a system to be deployed in emergencies. Something more like a capacity that had always been present, which years of patient attention and repeated return had gradually made available, not just in theory, but in the actual texture of being alive. The argument was still running when the student who had come in late looked up. Epictetus was talking about harm again, about what genuine harm is and what it is not, about the distinction between the damage that touches the body and the circumstances of a life. Real damage, real loss, not dismissed, and the deeper harm that the Stoic tradition had always considered the only harm that truly deserved the name, the corruption of the rational faculty itself, the abandonment of honest judgment, the substitution of false values for true ones, the slow erosion over years of habitual misdirection of the capacity to locate the difference between what is genuinely good and what merely appears to be. This was, for Epictetus, the only thing worth being truly careful about. Not illness, not poverty, not the loss of reputation or the failure of plans. These were difficulties, genuinely and worth responding to with skill and attention. But they did not, any of them, reach the place where the genuine harm could be done. The genuine harm was possible only from the inside, only through the governing faculty's own choices, only through the person's own ongoing act of assent to a false picture of where the good actually lived. This is why, throughout the discourses, Epictetus kept returning to the question of what a person is reaching for, not as a moral judgment, not with the implication that desires are shameful, but with the patient insistence of someone asking a structural question. What is being treated as genuinely good here? What is the desire assuming about where goodness lives? Because the desire that is aimed at externals is permanently vulnerable to the way externals behave, and the desire aimed at the rational faculty's own integrity is permanently at home. The afternoon light had moved. The pale bars across the floor of the room in Nicopolis had shifted slightly, the way light always shifts when a long time has passed and no one has been tracking it. Epictetus sat in his usual place, unhurried, and the students around him sat in theirs. What remained, at the close of what had been a long argument, was something that did not feel like the end of an argument. It felt more like the moment after a long walk, when the walking has settled into the body, and the destination, when finally reached, turns out to be less important than the quality of attention that the walk itself had required. The conclusion was not the point. The point was what had happened to the mind on its way there. A person who has genuinely followed this argument, not just heard it, but followed it through all the places where it resists and the places where it opens, arrives at a specific kind of recognition. Not the excited recognition of something new, but the quieter recognition of something that was always structurally true and is now simply visible. The governing center of the rational life is exactly as inviolable as the argument says it is. The gap between the impression and the assent is exactly as real as the careful attention of a well-practiced mind can make it. And the sovereignty that Epictetus spent his whole life pointing at, insisting on, returning to, with the patience of someone who understood that it needed to be returned to again and again and again. That sovereignty does not require any particular set of circumstances to be real. It is real now, in whatever room this is, in whatever state the body is in, with whatever the circumstances have brought to bear. The argument does not end at the boundary of the ruling faculty. It begins there. A student in the back of the room, the late one, the one who had arrived mid-sentence, wrote something down. Not the whole argument, not even a summary, just a sentence that had caught somewhere inside the thinking and settled. Arian did the same in his corner of the room, writing quickly in the way he always wrote quickly, trying to hold the voice on the page, not to make something permanent of it in the way monuments are permanent, but to keep it available, to make it possible to return to leave a door open in the text that any reader, in any circumstance, in any room, in any city, in any century, could find and step through and find themselves, without warning, inside the argument, inside the thinking, inside the question of where the boundary actually runs, inside the particular stillness of a mind that has found, somewhere in itself, the exact interior edge that nothing external has been able to cross. And the returning to it, this is what Epictetus taught again and again, without growing impatient with the repetition. The returning to it is not a failure to have arrived permanently. The returning is the practice. The returning is what the freedom is made of. Not a destination held once and never lost, but a room one always knows how to find, entered again each time with the recognition of something familiar, something that was here before, and is here now, and will be here when the thinking comes back to it, quiet and undisturbed, exactly as it was. Arian was sitting at the edge of the room, his stylus moving faster than was comfortable, trying not to lose the thread of what Epictetus had just said. The words were not slow. They never were. Epictetus taught the way water moves, not urgently, but with a pressure behind each sentence that made it feel as though the next one were already gathering. Arian was not composing, he was catching, and even as his hand moved across the wax, he understood that what he was doing was not quite like anything that had been done before in a philosopher's school, not in Athens, not in Alexandria, not anywhere along the long tradition from which this small room in Nicopolis had descended. The problem with philosophy, as it had often been practiced, was that it arrived already composed. A treatise came to its reader finished, and still, the arguments were there, the objections anticipated, the terms defined in their places, the conclusion waiting at the end like a door one had been walking toward since the first page. What Arian was watching was something different. The arguments were alive in the room. They changed slightly under the weight of a student's confusion, bent toward a particular worry, returned to their shape after being pressed into an awkward application. The philosophy was not being presented. It was being used in real time on the actual difficulties that real people had carried in through the door that morning. Arian wrote quickly and understood that the thing he was trying to hold on the page was exactly what pages were not designed to hold. He wrote down what he could. He wrote the questions and the answers and the silences between them, The moments when Epictetus waited for a student to arrive at something rather than handing it to them. He wrote the tone where he could find it, patient, occasionally sharp, never cruel. When he had collected enough of these mornings and afternoons, he gathered what he had into books, and he sent them into the world with a preface that said plainly what he had been attempting. He had not, he wrote, composed these things. He had recorded the voice of a man speaking, and if the voice came through, then the work was done. If it did not come through, then the record was at least accurate, and some fragment of accuracy was better than the fully polished silence of a man who had decided to write a proper book instead. The preface survives. The discourses survive. 8 books in intention, 4 in the form that has come down through the centuries. And the survival is itself a kind of argument about what philosophy, at its most alive, is made of, and about what kind of writing is capable of carrying the living thing forward across time without killing it in transit. What Arion produced was unusual enough in the ancient world that later readers noticed. This was not a dialogue, in the manner of Plato, where the living exchange had been transformed into literary art, the questions made more pointed, and the answers more shaped than any real conversation could have been. This was something rawer and stranger. Epictetus speaks in the discourses the way a person speaks when they are thinking alongside someone else, not when they are performing an already reached position. He backtracks. He sharpens a formulation mid-sentence and tries again. He addresses the student in the room by something close to their actual discomfort, rather than by a cleaned-up version of it. The genre of the text is not a treatise, not a dialogue, not a letter. It is, as closely as any ancient document manages, a classroom. And then there is the shorter book, the one that fits in a hand. The Enchiridion came from the same source, Arion's notes, the same schoolroom, the same voice, but it arrived at something quite different in form and intention. Where the discourses sprawl, alive and particular, the Enchiridion compresses. It was designed to be carried. Its title says so plainly. The word means in Greek that which is held in the hand, and the naming was not decorative. A person was supposed to take this with them, not to read through from beginning to end, and then set down on a shelf and think about occasionally. To open on a difficult morning, find a sentence, hold the sentence in front of whatever was pressing on them at that hour, and see if the sentence held steady under the weight of it. The first sentence of the Enchiridion does not warm up before arriving at its point. It states in the plainest possible grammar that some things are in our power and some things are not. That is the beginning. There is no preamble, no greeting, no concession to the difficulty of what is about to be said. The line drops into the page with the weight of something that has been handled many times and has been found to hold. A Roman student opening the handbook on a morning when something had gone badly wrong, a failed appointment, a patron's cold reception, the news that an exam had not gone as hoped, would have encountered that sentence before anything else, and the sentence would have asked them immediately to draw a line down the middle of their situation and sort out which side of it they were standing on. The design was deliberate. Philosophy understood in this way was not a subject to be completed and stored alongside other things one had learned. It was in the Stoic understanding that ran through Epictetus and back through his teachers and their teachers before them, more like a practice that had to be taken up each morning fresh, because each morning the world provided new occasions for confusion, and each morning the mind's tendency to reach for the wrong things had to be, again, carefully redirected. The handbook was not for people who had finished their philosophical education. It was for people who were in the middle of a day and needed something to hold on to. The philosophy was built for that. This was not the Stoic tradition's only understanding of how philosophy ought to be transmitted, but it was Epictetus's understanding, and it shaped every quality of what survived from him. Musonius Rufus, who had taught Epictetus in Rome, and whose own lectures Arrian was not the first to write down, had insisted throughout his teaching life that philosophy belonged everywhere a person actually lived, in the choices made about food and money and how one spoke to a servant, not only in the rarefied air of theoretical argument. Epictetus absorbed this and went further because he had lived it further. The theoretical air was never where he had been. He had been in a household, under ownership, learning by long and close experience that the distinctions philosophy drew between what was genuinely one's own and what was not were not academic. They were survival. And what had been survival became, over years, and in a schoolroom in Nicopolis, something available to anyone willing to sit down and think carefully about where they were placing the full weight of their care. The students came from across the Roman world to do exactly that. Nicopolis was not Rome, it was not Athens. It sat in northwestern Greece, on the coast near the straits where the Ambracian Gulf opens into the Ionian Sea, and it had been founded by Augustus on the site of his victory at Actium, a city built out of triumph, which was fitting, perhaps, for a place where a former slave taught that triumph and defeat were in the deepest sense the same kind of thing, because neither of them reached all the way to what mattered. The students arrived young and educated, and often troubled by the specific troubles of the educated young, the worry about reputation, about whether they were impressing the right people, about whether the career they were building was the right one. Epictetus met them with patience and without softening what he had to say. He asked them what they actually wanted. He asked them whether what they wanted was within their reach. He asked them to look carefully at the answer before deciding whether they had a genuine problem or only an assumption that was costing them their peace without improving their situation. The discourses are full of these exchanges. A student arrives convinced he has been humiliated. Epictetus asks who humiliated him. The student explains. Epictetus asks what was taken from him, specifically that belonged to him. The student says his reputation was damaged. Epictetus asks whether reputation is something the student makes or something other people assign. The conversation turns, slowly, on the question of what is actually the student's to possess, and by the time it arrives somewhere, the student has often begun to see that the thing he came in grieving over was never his to hold in the first place, which is not comfort exactly, but it is something sturdier than comfort, because it does not depend on getting the thing back. These conversations were what Arrian was trying to hold on the page, and they are, 2,000 years later, still doing what they were designed to do, which is make the argument present in a way that a finished treatise cannot quite manage. The treatise tells one what Epictetus concluded. The discourses show the concluding happening, which is a different thing and a more useful one for a person who is not yet at the conclusion but is somewhere in the middle of a difficulty. The theatrical metaphor arrived often in Epictetus's teaching, in both the discourses and the handbook. It is one of the ideas that surfaces repeatedly in slightly different forms, as though he returned to it because it continued to find new purchase in new conversations. The image was this: life assigns each person a role, and the role is not chosen. One is born into a particular family, a particular social position, a particular set of circumstances that determine, in broad outline, the character one is playing in the world's ongoing performance. What is not assigned, what remains, entirely and without exception, the player's own, is the quality of the playing, Whether the role is large or small, admired or overlooked, filled with good fortune or pressed against difficulty, the work of playing it well is the same. It consists in bringing to the role one's full attention, one's clearest judgment, one's most honest effort. The role's prestige says nothing about the quality of the playing. A person who plays a minor role with complete integrity has done something philosophically significant. A person who plays a great role badly, which usually means with too much attachment to the greatness of it, has missed the point of the performance entirely. The metaphor does careful work. It separates what is given from what is owed. It clarifies what success and failure actually mean for a person who is trying to live well, not the applause at the end, not the size of the role, but the quality of the attention brought to whatever the role is. And it allows for an honest reckoning with the fact that circumstances are not equal, that some people begin with advantages others do not have, without letting that inequality become the determining fact about anyone's philosophical life. Epictetus himself was the best argument for the distinction the metaphor drew. He had not chosen the role, he had chosen with great care how to play it. Marcus Aurelius came to this teaching from a position that could not have been more different from Epictetus's. He was emperor of Rome. He had not chosen that either, not entirely. He had been adopted into the position, trained for it, installed in it by forces larger than any single person's preference. His correspondence with his teacher Fronto shows a young man genuinely uncertain about the obligations of an imperial education, drawn to philosophy in a way his training had not quite prepared him for. At some point, the Stoic tradition reached him, and Epictetus, though he had died a generation earlier, reached him through it. The Enchiridion, the discourses, the ideas they carried, these arrived in Marcus's hands and did not leave. He returned to them throughout his life with a constancy that was not the constancy of admiration, but of need. He needed the tools. He was a man doing an extremely difficult job, in difficult times, under the full weight of empire, and he found in Epictetus's teaching the only philosophical framework that seemed to hold steady when everything else was pressing. What Marcus wrote in his private journal, the document that has come to be called the Meditations, though he gave it no name and intended no reader, is not a philosophical treatise. It is not even quite a diary. It is more like a series of arguments made to himself, some of them made more than once, returning to the same formulations, not because the formulations had failed, but because the mind that held them needed to hold them again. He paraphrases Epictetus. He restates the dichotomy of control. He reminds himself, sometimes with a slight edge of impatience with his own forgetting, that the things pressing on him from outside, the military campaigns, the court intrigues, the deaths of children, the failing health, are not in the domain of what is genuinely his. What is his is the quality of judgment he brings to them, the note of the return again, the return once more. It runs through the Meditations like a quiet river, and it is recognizably Epictetan in its source. A Roman emperor in a military tent in the dark, writing by lamplight, turning to the ideas of a freed slave, because those ideas were the truest thing he had found. There is something in this that the philosophical tradition itself has occasionally paused to notice, not as a reversal of fortune or a surprise of history, but as evidence that the ideas were reaching towards something real. The Stoic account of inner sovereignty was not a consolation prize for people who had lost in the competition for external goods. Marcus had not lost that competition, he had won it entirely, by the world's measures. What he had found was that the winning did not settle what he had been hoping it would settle, and that Epictetus, speaking from a position of radical external constraint, had understood better than almost anyone what the settling actually required. The text traveled. Every text travels if it survives, and survival is partly luck and partly the fact that subsequent readers found the thing useful enough to copy. The discourses moved through the ancient world in manuscript form, passed from teacher to student, from one school's library to another's, accumulated marginal notes in Greek and Latin, from readers who found a sentence that needed marking because it had landed precisely on something they had been trying to think about. The Enchiridion traveled even more easily, being small. It was read by Neoplatonists and by early Christian monks who found in its emphasis on interior discipline and the management of desire something compatible with their own practices, even when the philosophical framing differed. Simplicus, a 6th century Neoplatonist, wrote a commentary on the Enchiridion that runs longer than the original, and the commentary is the work of a careful reader, finding the ideas still alive and worth wrestling with. 4.5 centuries after Arrian wrote down what Epictetus had said in the schoolroom in Nicopolis. The manuscript tradition that carried the text across the early medieval period and into the Italian libraries, where Renaissance scholars began to take notice of it, is not a glamorous one. It involves scribes in monasteries copying texts they may not have entirely understood, preserving them because preservation was the work, because the old books deserved to survive even when their particular content was not directly relevant to the current theological moment. Some texts were lost. The discourses that survive are probably half of what Arrian collected. The other half is not quoted extensively enough by other ancient authors to be reconstructed, and so it is simply gone, a reminder that the survival of what remains is not inevitable, but something closer to a long series of narrow passages, all somehow navigated. What came through is enough. The Enchiridion is complete. The 4 books of the discourses are there, and they are, as the long sequence of readers found them, tools, not monuments to be visited, but instruments to be used, and the use is exactly what Epictetus said it was, the daily, patient, somewhat unglamorous work of noticing where one's judgment has gone wrong and bringing it back, noticing where one has placed desire in the domain of what is not one's own, and gently, without drama, removing it. Arrian's preface is worth returning to, because it says plainly something that most philosophical authors, at every period, have been reluctant to say plainly. He had not written the book, he insisted, in any meaningful sense, and he had been present when someone else was thinking, and he had tried to capture that presence on the page. The result was not a monument to Epictetus. It was, in the best case, a shadow of the living encounter, close enough in shape to be useful, far enough from the original to serve as a constant reminder that the text was never the point. The point was the practice the text was trying to lead one toward. The text was a door. The room behind it was not made of sentences. This is a strange thing to say about a written work, and Arrian understood the strangeness of it. He also understood that the alternative, composing a polished literary dialogue, smoothing the roughness of the classroom exchange into something more formally beautiful, would have produced exactly the kind of philosophy Epictetus had spent his life arguing against. From the formal treatise, implies that philosophy is a domain in which one becomes competent by acquiring the right arguments in the right order until one has the full set and can deploy them correctly. What the discourses imply is something quite different, that philosophy is a practice in which one makes the same mistakes repeatedly, returns to the same distinctions repeatedly, and improves not by acquiring arguments, but by letting the arguments act on the actual fabric of how one moves through a day. There is no graduation from this. Marcus Aurelius, in his tent, had not graduated. He was still at it. That was, in its own way, the point. A worn book in a pair of hands, opened not at the beginning and not at a marked page, but at whatever page the opening of the book offered. This is close to how the Enchiridion was probably often used. Not as a linear text to be followed from its first sentence to its last, but as a field of sentences, any one of which might be the right one for a given moment. The reader brought the morning's difficulty to the text, and the text offered something back, not an answer, not a solution to the specific trouble, but a reorientation, a way of looking at the trouble from a position slightly different from the one the trouble itself had established. The reorientation was not always comfortable. Epictetus was not comfortable in the way of a text that confirms what one already believed. He was comfortable in the way of a very cold, very clear body of water that once entered makes one feel more awake than before. Students who had studied with him in Nicopolis and returned to their cities, Alexandria, Rome, Smyrna, Carthage, carried what they had taken in with them, the way one carries something that has become part of one's thinking, without being easily separable from it. The specific arguments they could have repeated, the vocabulary they could have given back accurately, the principal doctrines they could have set out for a curious friend. But those were not the thing they carried. What they carried was a habit of attention, a tendency, when something went wrong, to pause before the first response, to look at what was actually in their power before deciding how to act, not because they had memorized that this was the right procedure, but because they had sat in a room long enough and listened to Epictetus ask enough different people the same fundamental question, what here is actually yours to govern, that the question had become part of the structure of how they looked at things. Philosophy transmitted in this way is harder to track than philosophy transmitted through a formal text. The text leaves a clear record. The habit of attention leaves almost none. One sees its traces, occasionally, in the way a letter is written, in the choice made in a moment of genuine pressure, in the absence of a certain kind of desperate grasping that one might have expected to see from a person in a difficult situation. The Stoic student who had genuinely absorbed the teaching did not leave much evidence of the absorption, because the absorption showed itself in what was not done, in the quality of steadiness that was not remarkable, because it did not call attention to itself. This is part of what made Arrian's work so valuable and so strange. He had chosen to record not the philosophical conclusions that could have been set down in a treatise, but the living process by which those conclusions were arrived at, again and again, in the company of different students with different difficulties. The record is of a practice, not of a result, and the practice being something that each subsequent reader had to take up in their own time and their own circumstances, transferred in a way that results cannot quite transfer. One cannot take on the result without the practice. The Enchiridion cannot be carried in the hand as a completed acquisition. It is carried in the hand as something still in use. The sequence of transmission, Epictetus speaking, Arrian writing, students reading, centuries passing, new readers opening the same pages in new conditions, is not a triumphal march of wisdom through time. It is quieter than that, more contingent, marked by losses as well as survivals. The books that did not make it through the narrow passages of the manuscript tradition are gone, and the philosophy is somewhat smaller for that. What remained because enough people found it worth the labor of preservation, which is a form of continued endorsement that stretches across generations without anyone having planned it that way. And what those generations of preservers and readers found, each in their own time, was something they recognized, not because they had encountered it before, but because the thing being pointed at was a feature of their own experience that they had not previously had the language for. The capacity to pause before responding, the noticing of what is actually within reach and what is not, the quiet discovery that a great deal of what had felt like an emergency was an emergency only because of how the mind had been holding it, and that a slight shift in the holding, a movement of attention from what cannot be governed to what can, changed the quality of the emergency without changing any of the external facts. The Enchiridion rests on whatever surface it has been set down on, in whatever century. Its pages are worn or crisp, depending on how long it has been in a particular set of hands. Its sentences are the same sentences Arrian wrote down in Nicopolis, in the years when Epictetus was teaching and the mornings were still cool before the schoolroom filled. The sentences have not changed. What changes is the person who opens the book and finds in the particular sentence that meets their particular morning something that steadies the hand before the day goes on. The Stoic tradition, running from Zeno through the centuries and arriving in Epictetus at its most sustained and personal voice, was always most interested in this steadying, not in the production of beautiful philosophical arguments, though it produced those too, not in the advancement of a theoretical system, though it had one carefully constructed and internally consistent, most interested in the practical question of what to do with a day, with a difficulty, with a situation that had arrived without being invited and was not going to leave simply because it was unwelcome. The philosophy was for that, the texts were for that, the schoolroom in Nicopolis was for that, and Arrian's notes, hurriedly taken at the edge of the room, stylus moving quickly, were for that too, an act of preservation that understood what it was preserving was not a monument, but a working method, one that the next morning would make newly necessary, and the morning after that. Long after the school in Nicopolis closed, and the generations of students dispersed, and the specific timbre of Epictetus's voice was no longer available to anyone, what remained in the text was the quality of the questions he had trained his students to ask. The questions themselves do not age in the way that answers age. Answers become obsolete as circumstances change. Questions, if they are aimed at something genuinely fundamental about how a person stands in relation to what happens to them, remain because what they are pointed at remains. The morning difficulty is always the morning difficulty. The impulse to reach for what cannot be reached is always there, and the steady work of noticing it and redirecting is always the same work. The Enchiridion, small and worn and still, rests open in the dark. Its first line is as it has always been. The thinking it was designed to lead one toward is patient. There is no urgency in it and no expiration. Whatever morning comes next will find it the same. A student came to Epictetus one evening after the others had gone and sat down without speaking. He did not bring a question. He did not bring an argument to test or a passage from the old teachers to dispute. He brought only the thing itself, the feeling, unresolved, sitting somewhere in the chest, too familiar to name and too persistent to ignore. Epictetus looked at him for a moment. Then he asked, in the same tone he used for everything, neither softer nor harder than the work required, "What is it that you are carrying? Not what happened, not who was responsible. What are you carrying?" The student thought this was a simpler question than it turned out to be. He began to speak about the circumstances, the thing that had occurred, the person involved, the way it had unfolded. Epictetus listened. He did not interrupt. When the student finished, Epictetus sat with the silence for a moment, and then asked again, with the same patience, in almost the same words, "But what is the thing itself, the thing that stays. This distinction between what happened and what remains was not a deflection. It was the beginning of something precise. Epictetus had spent a long time watching the way feelings moved in people, the way they arrived, seemed to pass, and then surfaced again days later, wearing slightly different shapes. He had noticed that the feelings which persisted longest were not always the ones attached to the largest events. They were the ones attached to the most firmly held judgments. The grief that returned every morning was not grief about a fact. It was grief sustained by a conviction that the fact was not how things should have been, that something was owed that had not been given, that the world had behaved incorrectly and would not correct itself. The judgment kept the feeling alive, and the judgment, unlike the fact, was within reach. This was not a comfortable teaching. It asked something difficult. It asked the student to look not at what had been done to him, but at the structure of his own response, not to find himself blameless or blameworthy, but simply to find himself present in the experience, participating in it, somewhere in the machinery of it. And once found there, to ask, what exactly am I assenting to when I hold this feeling as though it were a fact about the world rather than a movement in the mind? The evening light was low, the room was quiet. Epictetus did not rush the question toward an answer. The Stoic teachers before him had made this observation in different forms. They had argued with considerable care that what most people call emotions are not simply things that happen to a person, not events that arrive from outside and take hold the way weather takes hold of an open field. They are, at the level of their origin, acts of evaluation. To feel fear is to have judged that something bad is approaching and that it threatens something genuinely valuable. To feel grief is to have judged that something genuinely good has been lost. To feel anger is to have judged that a wrong has been done and that the wrongness matters. These judgments may be correct, they may be partially correct, or they may be built on a misdirection, on the conviction that something external to the rational soul was the true foundation of well-being, and that its loss or threat constitutes a genuine harm. Epictetus did not deny the feelings. He did not counsel the student to stop feeling. The Stoic tradition had always been misread on this point, and Epictetus knew it. The goal was never a kind of gray interior flatness, a life from which all movement had been drained. The word for what was being aimed at, apatheia, did not mean the absence of feeling. It meant something closer to freedom from the distorting passions, the ones that pulled the rational soul off course, by convincing it that external fortune was the measure of everything. What lay on the other side of those passions was not emptiness. It was something warmer and more specific, a set of feelings the Stoic teachers distinguished carefully from the passions, feelings that were proportionate and clear and did not pull against the grain of understanding. There was a word for these steadier states, gathered under the name eupatheia, joy of a kind that did not depend on circumstances holding still, a careful wish for what was genuinely good, a caution that turned away from what was genuinely worth avoiding, not the frantic avoidance of everything uncertain, but the clear-eyed preference for what a person of good judgment would prefer. These were not cold substitutes for feeling. They were what feeling looked like when the mind had stopped confusing the furniture of the world with the source of what mattered. The student sat with this. He had come in carrying something heavy. The heaviness had not lifted, not yet, but something in the way the question had been put to him had shifted the angle of it, had moved it, slightly from the category of things that had been done to him into the category of things he was holding and had been holding for some time with considerable effort in a particular way. This was the work, not the insight alone, which could arrive quickly and dissolve just as quickly when the feeling surged again in the night. The work was the slow practice of returning to the question, not once, but many times, in many different lights, with different feelings standing at the door. Epictetus had not promised it would be fast. He had not promised it would be complete. He had only said that the place where the work happened was inside, and that inside was where the person lived, and that this was not a limitation, but the most useful fact a person could sit with. The Stoic teachers had mapped the territory of the passions with some care. They had identified four that they considered the main sources of chronic disturbance: desire, fear, pleasure, and distress, and they had organized them around a simple axis. Two pointed toward the future, two addressed the present. Desire reached forward towards something it had judged good and wanted to secure. Fear reached forward towards something it had judged bad and wanted to escape. Pleasure settled into something present, having judged it good and wanting to hold it. Distress contracted around something present, having judged it bad and finding it unbearable. Each of these four was built on a valuation, and each valuation was built on an assumption about where genuine good and genuine bad were located. When the assumption held that genuine good was located in external things, in health, reputation, the safety of people loved, the continuation of circumstances that had been pleasant, then the passions were almost entirely out of the person's hands. The world would move as it moved. Health would fluctuate. Reputation would be distributed by people whose judgment had nothing to do with what was actually true. The people loved would face everything that mortal things face. The pleasant circumstances would change, and with each change, the passions would register the movement and register it as damage, because they had been oriented toward the things that changed. Epictetus had watched this closely. He had seen it in his students, who arrived anxious and left less anxious, only to return anxious again when the next thing shifted. He had seen it in the public life of Rome, where men of great resources and considerable intelligence spent their lives in a state of almost continuous agitation over the movements of fortune, as though fortune had agreed to hold still for them and kept breaking the agreement. He did not find this contemptible. He found it, in a very plain sense, mistaken, the way a person who has been walking in a direction that does not lead where they want to go is not culpable, but simply in need of a different bearing. The different bearing was not complicated to describe. It was simply difficult to inhabit with consistency. Orient the desires and aversions toward what is actually within reach of the rational will. Desire virtue, the quality of judgment and action that belongs entirely to the person. Avoid its opposite. Toward everything else, maintain what might be called a willing engagement without a desperate stake, an interest without a dependency, a preference without a demand. Health may be preferred to illness, and it is reasonable to work toward it, but the preference must not be held with the grip that turns its absence into catastrophe. The grip was the problem. The preference, calmly held, was entirely compatible with a clear mind. The student had been gripping something. He knew it by now. The weight he had carried in was not the weight of what had happened. Those events were over, fixed, no longer available for alteration. The weight was the grip, the sustained effort of holding a judgment in place that required continuous effort to hold, the judgment that things should have been otherwise, that the should carried genuine moral force, that the world owed a correction it was not going to make. Releasing a grip is not the same as pretending the thing gripped was worthless. This was the subtlety the Stoic teachers were careful about, and Epictetus returned to it often. To set down the anguish of a loss was not to say the lost thing had not mattered. It had mattered, and in the right register, The register of preferred things, things genuinely good in the secondary sense, it was entirely appropriate that it had mattered. The grief was not a mistake. The holding was the mistake. The holding was the mistake. The holding, long past the moment when all the grief could do was keep the person standing in a place they could no longer inhabit usefully. That was what the practice asked a person to look at. Outside the room in Nicopolis, the evening would have settled into a particular kind of stillness, the stillness of a city at the end of a day's noise, when the streets emptied and the light went low and the air had a quality of having been used and now released. Epictetus would have noticed it without particular comment. He noticed things, but without the urgency of a person who needed what he noticed to mean something beyond what it was. The stillness was just stillness. The ending of the day was just the ending of the day. These facts required nothing from the person who observed them. This quality of attention, meeting what was present without immediately requiring it to be otherwise, was itself a kind of practice. It was not emptiness. It had a warmth to it, the warmth of a mind genuinely interested in what was there, rather than preoccupied with what was not. The Stoic goal was sometimes described in terms that made it sound like the removal of everything, remove the false valuations, remove the distorting passions, remove the grip on externals, and what remained. But what remained was not nothing. What remained was the undistorted capacity for exactly this kind of attention, clear, present, unfrightened. The student would return again, not that evening, but later, when the feelings surfaced again in a new form, carrying a new face. And Epictetus would ask again, in the same patient tone, without accusation and without impatience, and what is it exactly that you are holding? Not because the question would be different, because the student would be different and would hear it differently, having carried it for a while. The same question received each time at a slightly deeper level does slightly different work. This was the nature of the practice, not a single transformation, but a long series of small returns, each one making the next a little easier to find. The Stoic understanding of emotional suffering was, at its base, an argument about participation. Not that people cause their own suffering in a simple or blaming sense, but that in the structure of any sustained distress, there is something the person is doing, something they are holding or reaching toward or assenting to, and that this something is not entirely invisible. It can be found, not always quickly, not always easily, but it is there in the texture of the feeling itself, in the shape of the judgment underneath it. And because it is there, it is in principle reachable, not by a single act of will, but by the steady practice of returning to it, examining it, setting it down when possible, picking it up again when it returns, and setting it down once more with slightly less effort each time. This was what Epictetus meant when he spoke of the work of philosophy as something closer to medicine than to scholarship. The point was not to understand the theory. The point was to find the specific thing in the specific life that was producing the chronic disturbance, and to work at it with the patience and consistency that any genuine healing required. The theory was the map. The map was useful, but the map was not the territory, and holding the map without walking the territory accomplished nothing. A person who had practiced this for a long time began to notice something quiet happening. The feelings still came. The world still moved in ways that were not chosen. The things that were preferred were not always present, and the things that were dispreferred were not always avoidable. But something in the relationship to all of this had shifted. Gradually, without announcement, the feelings arrived and did not immediately harden into a position, and they moved through, were noticed, were held with a kind of interested attention rather than immediate alarm, and then, not always, not perfectly, but with increasing frequency passed. There is a word for the condition that this practice was working toward. The Stoics used ataraxia, a state of the mind that was not agitated, not in the sense of having had all agitation surgically removed, but in the sense of having developed a relationship to disturbance that was not itself disturbed. A deep steadiness that was not rigidity. It could be moved, could respond, could feel genuinely, but that had a center of gravity below the surface of the feeling, a place where the movement did not reach. Still water beneath the weather on the surface. The surface would break. The depth would not. The depth was not achieved. That was the important thing about it. It was, more accurately, recognized. The practice of Stoic philosophy did not build the depth. It cleared away what was obscuring the recognition that the depth had always been there. The rational soul, the hegemonikon, the governing center of the mind. These were not structures constructed by philosophy. They were the native condition of a person, present before any teaching arrived, simply unrecognized in the noise of the misdirected passions. Philosophy was the long, patient work of quieting the noise enough to notice what had been there all along. This was why Epictetus could speak of the work as a return rather than an arrival. The student who came in the evening carrying the familiar heaviness was not trying to become someone he had never been. He was trying to find his way back to something he had always had access to, and had, through the accumulated habit of reaching outward for the foundations of his well-being, temporarily mislaid. The path back was not short, but it was, in the most literal sense, a path home. Grief that had persisted longer than its occasion warranted, longer than the loss itself required, was usually sustained by a particular kind of thinking, not dramatic thinking, not catastrophic thinking necessarily, but the quiet, almost invisible thinking of a person who had decided, below the level of explicit awareness, that the world without this thing could not be navigated with any satisfaction, that the absence had foreclosed something essential, that the future shaped around this loss was a reduced future, a lesser version of what had been owed. This was the judgment that kept the grief in place long past the point where the grief was working on anything real, and this judgment could be found and examined, not with the goal of deciding the lost thing was worthless, but with the goal of finding out whether the absence truly foreclosed what it seemed to foreclose, or whether the foreclosure was itself a decision made in pain that could be unmade with patience. Epictetus had been through enough to know that this kind of examining was not always immediately possible. There were times when the feeling was simply too present, too loud, for the quieter work of examination to find footing. The Stoic practice did not demand that the work happen in those moments. It asked only that the work be returned to when the volume lowered enough to hear the question, not forcing, not performing detachment, simply returning, when possible, to the practice of looking at what was being held and asking whether it needed to be held in quite that way, with quite that grip, for quite that long. Anger was similar in structure. The anger that lingered, not the quick flash that moved through and was gone, but the sustained version, the one that returned to the same injury over days and weeks, was sustained by the judgment that the wrong that had been done was a wrong that could somehow be undone by the strength of the feeling about it, as though the anger itself were a kind of work being performed on the fact of the wrong, as though the intensity of the response were proportional to the seriousness of the objection. Epictetus had looked at this carefully and had found it not merely ineffective, but built on a confusion, the confusion between registering that something was wrong and insisting that the world had agreed to correct it. The registration was legitimate. The insistence was where the suffering attached. None of this made the wrong smaller. The wrong was what it was. The Stoic practice did not ask a person to stop caring about what was wrong. It asked, with considerable precision, for a careful accounting of what caring about it actually accomplished, what it cost, what it produced, whether the grip on the feeling was serving the person or the person was serving the grip. This accounting, when done honestly, tended to be clarifying, not comfortable, not immediately, but clarifying in the way that any honest look at something that has been costing more than it returns is clarifying. The student who had sat with Epictetus that evening left carrying something slightly different from what he had brought in, not a resolution, not a finished thought, something more like a question that had been carefully shaped, a question he could carry with him through the following days and return to when the feeling surfaced again. The question had been Epictetus's gift to him, not the answer. The answer, if there was one, would be found in the living of the question, not in a single exchange in a room at the end of a day. Long practice with this kind of examination produced something the Stoic teachers described with the word chara, a joy that was not dependent on circumstances, that did not require the world to hold a particular shape in order to be present. This was the genuine article of what the passions had been imitating, the pleasure that attached to external goods, to pleasant circumstances, to the approval of others, to the smooth running of what had been planned, was a real enough experience, but it was not stable, and it was not sovereign. It belonged to the circumstances, and when the circumstances changed, it changed with them. The chara that emerged from a mind whose desires and aversions had been gradually reoriented, that was something different, quieter, less sharp, but present in a way that did not require the world to keep cooperating. It arrived in odd moments, in the middle of an ordinary task performed without the background noise of wanting the circumstances to be otherwise, in the sitting with a question that could not be fully answered without the agitation of needing it answered, in the recognition, quiet, unannounced, that something had settled, not because everything was well in the external sense, but because the relationship to external things had changed enough that their movements no longer carried quite the same gravitational pull. Epictetus, sitting alone after the students had gone, in the room where the day's teaching had happened, would not have described his own condition with any drama. The stillness he sat in was not an achievement to be noted. It was simply the natural condition of a mind that had spent a long time returning to the same practice, the practice of noticing what it was reaching toward and asking each time whether the reaching was grounded in clear judgment or in the old habit of turning outward for the foundations of the good. The practice had not made him invulnerable. Things had been taken from him over the course of his life: status, ease, certainty, the unbroken company of people he had known. These were real losses, and he had not been required to pretend otherwise. But the losses had not taken the one thing that the Stoic practice had spent so long pointing toward. They had not taken the capacity for clear judgment. They had not taken the faculty of rational choice, the proeuress that met each situation with the same steady orientation, asking not what fortune had brought today, but what a person of good judgment would do with it. This was the long thread of it. Not a single teaching absorbed in a single sitting, but a continuous practice of returning to the question, to the examination, to the small act of putting down the grip and asking whether it had been necessary. Not once, again and again, in the mornings before the students arrived, in the evenings after they had gone, in the middle of the night when something surfaced that daylight had been too noisy to surface. The practice did not end, it deepened. Each return to it found the same ground, but found it more familiar, easier to stand on, requiring less effort to locate. A person who had been practicing for some time would notice that the worst of the disturbances came less frequently and lasted less long when they came, not because the world had grown kinder or more predictable, not because the things that had previously disturbed had ceased to matter, but because the response, the cognitive movement underneath the feeling, had been worked with long enough that it no longer had quite the same automated quality. There was increasingly a pause between the event and the response. In the pause, examination became possible, and in the examination, the feeling sometimes altered, not suppressed, not overridden, but met with enough clarity that its shape changed slightly, became lighter, became something that could be held rather than something that held the person. This pause was what the whole practice was working toward. The pause was freedom, in the only sense Epictetus considered genuine, not the freedom of being exempt from constraint, but the freedom of being present enough in the moment of response that the response could be, in some meaningful degree, chosen. Not chosen in the sense of being manufactured to specification, chosen in the sense of arriving from the governing center of the person, rather than from the accumulated habit of reaching outward for what could not be permanently secured. The room where Epictetus sat in the evenings was a plain room. There was not much in it, a lamp burning low, the residue of the day's conversations, ideas that had been turned over and turned over again, questions that had been sharpened by the resistance of careful students, the occasional insight that had arrived unexpectedly in the middle of an argument and had needed to be followed. None of this required a monument. The philosophy did not need marble. It needed only the willingness to keep returning to it, in ordinary conditions, in ordinary light, without the expectation of a final arrival. The lamp burned on in the quiet.